Hello, everyone, and welcome to this members-only edition of a program from the History Center. Today, we're going to be talking about a topic. I believe this is one that was requested, a history of the census. Not just the U.S. Census, but what are they and why do they exist? How long have they been around? It's a very interesting question. It's one of those things that history nerds can really dig into and kind of nerd out about. The United States has been keeping a census since 1790, but the process of counting people and trying to find out things about citizens and about people who live in nations, kingdoms, tribes has been going on for millennia. Our word census comes from the Latin censere, which means to estimate, which is a good way to put it because many of these censuses that we do are just estimations. We can't actually count every single person that exists in every single place, or can we? Maybe my guy William the Conqueror was able to do that, but we'll see when we get to that point. So when did people first start counting? We do know that as far back as ancient Egypt, the pharaohs wanted to get a count of everyone who was in their kingdom. Now, I hate to burst the bubble of myself and perhaps a lot of other folks. We think of the census, especially the U.S. Census, as this paradigm of rich information that we primarily use to delve into for historic facts, to do research, to determine more about our past and the people who came before us. It's supposed to be filled with all this great information. And it only exists to have that information for historical purposes, right? No, unfortunately not. Almost every census in history, going all the way back, has had a little more practical reason. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh did his counting because he wanted to know who did what in his kingdom. Why? So that he would know how much to tax them. This is going to be a very recurring theme when we're looking at the history of censuses. And going back even to ancient Greece, they did the same thing in ancient Greece. The Greeks wanted to know who had wealth, how much wealth they had, who were free citizens, who were the foreigners within the Greek city-state, so that they could keep regular tabs on how much to charge citizens tax, how much to charge for the foreigners tax and things like this. And also who was liable for military service and what kind. This is, again, a very, very continuing theme all the way through up to the present day. And I'll get to that more recent stuff in just a second. And there's also even a biblical precedent for this. In the Old Testament, the book of Numbers by Moses, there is a requirement from God to get a count of the Israeli people so that they can know what tax to charge for the upkeep of the tabernacle. As a matter of fact, that's why the book of Numbers is called Numbers. It is the numbering of the people of Israel by Moses himself, supposedly. But that's a great example of a biblical census. We've got ancient Greece, we have ancient Rome. Well, what about outside the West? Well, in China, we do have some information where some of the emperors were trying to discover how many people actually lived under their control, lived in their realm. And what's interesting about this is one of the first extant censuses that we have, not just notation that a census was taken, but the actual records themselves. Now, they're in very bad shape because they're very old. They're almost 2,000 years old. But from this, we're able to determine that in China at the time, the emperor had under his control 57 million subjects. Now, that may seem like a lot in some ways, and it may not seem like a lot compared to modern world population. But trust me, for the ancient world, that's a pretty big number. It wasn't until the Middle Ages when France was able to get up to about 16 or 17 million people that we know of, one of their first censuses. And perhaps the most famous medieval census is the Domesday Book, Domesday book. This is done by my fellow William the Conqueror. When he conquered England in 1066, he, of course, came into possession of the entire realm and its wealth. One of the reasons he had wanted to take England because he knew how wealthy it was, that it was a very expansive realm filled with population, a population that was growing and a very prosperous population. Well, if he's going to get a good accounting of how much tax revenue he can extract from England, how much wealth he can actually get, and who he's going to be able to control, he needs a very accurate count. And what's remarkable about Domesday is the absolute detail that it went into. In 1085, again, about 20 years after he actually conquers the entire realm and is able to put down some of those rebellions, he's able to settle down and decide, okay, now I'm going to govern my realm. And the first thing I need to do is to find out exactly who and what is in my realm. So he sends out scribes and men who can write and ask questions to every corner of the English kingdom to get this information. And I want to read to you, rather than just give you a better description of what it is, I'm going to read from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and tell you in their words what this census was. And you're going to see that another recurring theme is that a lot of times, since it's the power structures that are in place that are doing the census taking, that are doing the counting, and they're usually doing it for tax purposes or for military service purposes, it is perhaps not the most popular thing that a ruler can do. And this is very much reflected in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. After this had the king a large meeting and very deep consultation with his council about this land, how it was occupied and by what sort of men. Then he sent his men all over England into each shire, commissioning them to find out how many hundreds of hides there were in the shire, what land the king himself had, and what stock upon the land, or what dues he ought to have by the year from the shire. Also he commissioned them to record in writing how much land his archbishops had, his diocesan bishops, his abbots, and his earls. And though I may be prolix and tedious, what or how much each man had, who was the occupier of the land in England, either in land or in stock, and how much money it is worth. So very narrowly indeed did he commission them to trace it out, that there was not a single hide nor a yard of land. Nay, moreover, it is shameful to tell, though he thought it no shame to do it, not even an ox, nor a cow, nor a swine was there left that was not set down in his writ. And all the recorded particulars were afterward brought to him. And so all of this information was brought to William, and he was able to determine how much wealth he could get from it. Now, he's looking to get rich and squeeze every penny that he could from the land. And you can see from the way this is written that the way he did it and the very fact that he was doing it was, so the chronicler believed, considered shameful. And yet, what has come down to us in this day and age is a legendary, remarkable account of almost everyone in England alive in 1085, where they lived, who they had their land from, what their worth was, how many cows, pigs, chickens, orchards, trees, plows. Plows are mentioned in the Domesday book. And so we have this remarkably unique record of a very, very small slice of time of medieval life. It is rich and replete with things that people are still delving into today. And the history of the actual book, the actual leaves that are put together into the form of a book is probably a special program in and of itself. But that's an example of how deep some of these early censuses could go. And it was the same thing for the ancient Roman Empire. They wanted to determine who their citizens were. Remember, in ancient Rome, your level of citizenship was determined by your wealth, by your value, by the amount of goods that you held. And so the census done by ancient Rome was done to establish how high of a citizen you were and what your military service would be to the state and what your tax revenues were owed to the state. So that's what these censuses do in ancient Rome and in medieval England. But then there's sort of a break in people counting these things. Years go by. As I said, France does have a census, but going forward, these states and crowned heads want to know how much they can bring in, but they don't go through all the trouble, again, because it could be very unpopular with the people. But then something amazing happens. Skipping ahead a bit, we have the American Revolution. And the American Revolution, of course, not only secures the independence of the United States, but it happens right smack dab in the middle of the Enlightenment, a time when observation and reason is going to rule the day, so people think, and they want to look at the world very exactly and very scientifically. So it is within the United States Constitution set out that there would be a census every 10 years within the United States. Now, why was this census done? Again, I hate to break it to you, but it's for political and tax purposes. Article 1, Section 2 of the United States Constitution reads, "Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, excluding Indians not taxed 3/5 of all other persons." Basically, it says it will be done first in 1790, and then beginning thereafter every 10 years. So the census for the United States, the constitutional mandate, says that we have to do this, number one, to determine how many representatives each state and each territory will have within the federal government. Very important. In a representative democracy, in a republic, you have to know how many people there are so you can know how many representatives there should be working in the government for them, and to determine the tax base for the said representatives and the citizenry of the United States. And so when the United States initially began their censuses, they were only counting free whites, male and female, other free people, and slaves. That's the only three categories that initially began. And over the history of the U.S. Census, of course, it has attempted to get more and more information. And going through the decades, of course, when we get to the American Civil War, we begin to try to determine how many African Americans there are, how many, post-Civil War, they are free. And so the counting needs to happen for a variety of different purposes, too. This is somewhat suppressed in the South as the South pushes for segregation. And this really also shows, not only within the United States, but in all the past history, it's very easy for a census to be politicized. Having the number of people determines the number of representatives, which means you want your representatives to be as many as possible. And if you're a party person, a member of the right party. And so the census becomes highly politicized, not only based on the counts, but on the separate divisions and how different groups are counted. As I said at the very beginning, we only counted free whites, other free, and slaves. Now, I think today there are 24 different possibilities to check a box. White, Latino, Hispanic, Chicano, Aleutian, Pacific Islander, Hawaiian, lots of different ones, because the census is trying to get a more accurate count of the demographics of the country in which we live. And the census, when it first happens in the early history of the United States, you have to remember this is a lot of information they're trying to gather together in the pre-information age. There's only one way to do this. This is to have enumerators, which is the technical term for folks who go out and work for the census. They will ride into an area, they will carry their book, and they will go farm to farm, house to house, and try to write down who is the head of household and where the other settlements are, where should I go that I may not have been yet, and write down the head of house, how much land they own, things like that. And each census, as time has gone by, has had various and different sets of questions, ranging in different detail. So how hard was it to actually go around in the early republic and get an accurate census count? It was very difficult. And fortunately, we have a great account from right here in Hall County. Hall County was incorporated in 1818, which means we made it just in time to be a part of the 1820 census. And as this shows, going in 1820 Hall County and trying to get an accurate count certainly had its challenges. So as you can see, when there are no roads or when the roads are very bad and you're having to do every single house and every single person by hand, there are a lot of challenges. And perhaps some people consider themselves somewhat entrepreneurs. If they're going to have to do the work to be an enumerator, perhaps they should get reimbursed for it. So the information that all these American censuses have gathered have been, as I said, used at the time to determine representation, to determine tax base, to determine which militia section you were in, and if how many people in the household were due for militia or military service. But for us modern historians, the censuses provide an amazing amount of information and detail. The Census Department releases overall data, even in the most recent census we've had, of course, is the 2020 census, which was problematic because of COVID-19 and the pandemic and everything going on with that. They can release broad population trends in households and things like that, but they're not allowed by law to release the individual information for each family or for each person. Many of these would say, how old are the people within your house? What do they do? Can they read? Can they write? What is their work? Things like, lots of information that you can get from a historical perspective to get a lot of information. But a lot of these more recent censuses have individuals that are still alive. And so a law was put into place that the censuses can only be released, the actual full documentation with individual information can only be released 72 years after they were gathered. So the most recent batch of censuses that has been released from the United States government is the 1950 census, and it was literally just released this year, 2022. And and it's very interesting because that allows people to go back and see perhaps their parents or their grandparents, but not much else, because it's personal, private information, right? The folks who were subject to a census in the past may not have wanted to tell exactly how much they were worth, maybe trying to slide under and get into a different tax bracket. They may not have wanted the government to know as much, and that is a concern because it's personal information. A lot of folks literally tried to avoid the census, and that not only back in the day in the 1810s, 20s, 30s, but even into the early 20th century. And in the early 20th century, they were bootleggers, and they may have thought the government was after them, so they may have hid out in the mountains and not wanted to report things. They may not have wanted to be subject to the military draft when that does start up during the American Civil War, then later on in World War I and World War II. So lots of resistance and fear of the census, and unfortunately, there's a very bad aspect to this. Even though the private information is supposed to be sacrosanct within the Census Department, no other government agency, much less individual or business, but no government agency is supposed to be allowed to go and look at this individual information. Well, sometimes that has been honored more in the breach than in the observance. The most despicable version of this is after the 1940 census. Of course, the 1940 census takes place, and we, a little over a year later, are at war with Germany and Japan. You may ask yourself, how did all the Japanese Americans, how are they rounded up so effectively and put into internment camps? Well, one of the questions that had been asked on the 1940 census was about of Japanese descent, of Pacific Islander descent, things like that, and it was filled out. So in 1941 and 42, the federal government goes to, the FBI goes to the Census Department, and with a specific War Powers Act that was signed into Congress, secretly goes into the census data for 1940, just a year or two before, and begins to make lists of all the Japanese Americans who live in certain areas in certain states, in California, on the West Coast, and things like that. And those are the lists that are developed by the FBI and the larger federal government that are checked off as they put Japanese Americans into the internment camps for mostly the duration of the war. Again, it should be stated that this is a violation of the intent of the census, violation of American law at the time, and yet nevertheless there it is, and that instance has unfortunately left a significant bad taste in many people's mouths, not just Japanese Americans, but those who would question, can this data be accessed for nefarious purposes by the federal government, by foreign agents, by hacking? Remember, everything's digitized now, because even though we had to go on horseback up and down hills with no roads in 1820, in 2020, and in a couple of decades previous, much of the counting was computerized and put into electronic databases. Again, great for record keeping, great for future historians to have, but it does present a question of privacy and being able to maintain, the privacy of individual information. Now, the census, however, the modern census, when you want to begin developing, as I said, they can't give individual information, but the U.S. Census Department does actually gather all of this information and makes it available. And if you are curious, if you want to spend hours and hours going down a rabbit hole like a true historian or even an amateur nerd about this sort of thing, you can go to the websites. The main website for the Census Department is census.gov, and they can give you the information about, how the census is gathered and the processes they use. They have a lot of other surveys that the Census Department takes care of, Bureau of Statistics for crime, labor, lots of different things that is under the purview of the Census Department. And if you want to actually start digging into the old census records and looking at some of the more up-to-date information, you can go to data.census.gov, and you can put in all kinds of search terms. In this one, I've just put in Georgia because we live in Georgia, and that's where the History Center is. And you can look at a lot of different information, again, not down to the individual level, but you can look at the different types of businesses, the different makeups of people, how many people are married, unmarried, what age groups they are, what the racial makeup is, what the demographics are of the United States and specific states. There's a ton of information that is not only useful, but is just very, very interesting to take a look at. So the census for the United States has been something that has been around since not quite the founding, but certainly since the development of a constitutional government. And it's been an important part of how we look at ourselves, how we count ourselves. And we just kind of want to know, a simple question of how many people are there. And I'm going to leave you with this one last graphic. This is basically the census, right? We've gone back and we've looked at data that we can gather from old censuses, plus the modern look at things, and look at the growth of world population. Going all the way back to almost the year 1000, the population rate stayed pretty much the same. There wasn't a significant amount of growth over time until you start to get into the industrialized era. When you start to get into the industrialized era with a global economy, with more food markets that can open and surpluses of food and start to control disease a little better and advances in medical technology, you can see that growth rate of the world population just take off. And so the world didn't really hit the 1 billion people mark until sometime around between 1900 and 1920. We're not exactly sure when. That was only 100 years ago, folks. So for all of human history, there were less than 1 billion people on the planet until 100 years ago. And between that time and between now, we're almost at 8 billion people. That is a significant growth rate. There's lots of issues there, but I just want you to understand that this is also what a census can do, not only on local, state, national, but on a world level. We have to know what these figures are so we can plan for things like agricultural growth, infrastructure, lots of different things that people need to know in terms of how many people live where, what they do, what they need to do, so that future planning can take place. And the more this becomes a complex, organized, modern state and world, the more that planning is going to be necessary and the more important, accurate counts are going to be. So this has been just a brief history of counting people, of a census. I encourage you to look around yourself, count the people around you. Ask them questions. Tell them, don't worry about it. It's for tax purposes, and see the look that you get. But I also encourage you to go to those websites, especially the U.S. government websites, because there's a lot of modern, current demographic information on there, but you can start looking at a lot of the old census records, and it's just fascinating. You can just go pick a decade year and start flipping through the place where you live now, Georgia, Hall County, and you can see they're all handwritten, and there's a lot of very interesting information, a lot of interesting names, a lot of interesting professions that are in those. And like I said, be careful, folks. It's a rabbit hole that you can go down and spend hours and hours on. Thanks for tuning in. I hope this has been interesting. I hope it's been enlightening, and I hope it's encouraged you to go and do a little bit of digging on yourself about the U.S. Census and about the history of censuses in general. So until we meet again, please come by the History Center if you're close. If not, continue watching our videos and tell everyone you know to follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. And until I see you again, stay safe and take care.